this evening. I'm Professor Susan Lee from BuVotes and the College of General Studies Social Sciences Division. And we're very happy to have you here for this presentation tonight. We have two CGS faculty members who are going to be presenting. And our presentation tonight is sponsored by several organizations. So let me just say briefly what those organizations are. The first one is BuVotes. It's a coalition of faculty, staff, and students at Boston University trying to encourage student voter engagement and other sorts of civic engagement as well. So BuVotes is one of the sponsors of the presentation tonight. Another sponsor is Better Elections Now, and that is also a BU-based organization that's interested in reforming the electoral process. I'll put I put them before and I'll put them again, the website for those two organizations. And then the presentation tonight is also sponsored by the World Affairs Forum of the College of General Studies, a student discussion group. So thank you all for being here. So let me just introduce our two speakers. Dr. Sean Lynch is an historian at the College of General Studies. He got his PhD from Boston College and specializes in US political history. So he has looked at civil liberties, he's looked at the labor movement in the United States, he's studied the Reagan Revolution, as well as neoliberalism, so all US political history. And he's also interested in modern British history, especially the recent Brexit movement. So those are all Dr. Lynch's interests. Dr. Daniela Mello has her PhD in political science from the University of Connecticut. And Dr. Mello is interested in European politics. So she studied political systems in several of the European countries, including Spain, Portugal, the UK, Germany, and France. She's been particularly interested in women and politics, especially in Portugal, in the Portuguese Revolution. And she's also looked at US foreign policy, especially under Kissinger, and how the US interacted with Portugal during the time of the Portuguese Revolution. So both of our speakers tonight, very interested in political developments, and so very well positioned to speak to our subject tonight. Each one is going to speak about 20 or 25 minutes, and then we'll take questions at the end. And if you would like to post questions in the chat box as they're speaking, feel free to do that, and then we can pick them up at the end of the presentation. So once again, thank you for coming. And Dr. Lynch, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We both really appreciate it. Before I jump into the first part of the presentation, I wanted to note that BuVotes is not a partisan organization. It just wants everyone to vote. I've also given you our emails if you have questions. And I have posted the link. I'm going to do it again for the Google Slide document that you see before you. And I would invite you to please go through the whole thing when you have time and send me any questions or send Dr. Mello any questions. I'm going to talk to you about some dysfunctions in the system, which is very depressing, but high voter turnout can overcome those dysfunctions temporarily. So everything can be fixed. Everything can be fixed in a single constitutional amendment, which is why at the end of this presentation, I gave you a sample amendment that tries to fix everything in one amendment. It can be done in one amendment. So everything can be fixed, it's just that no one has fixed it. What we now know for 2020 is that we're seeing a tidal wave of early voting. As of noon today, 40 million people have already voted. And I heard a Republican pollster the other night say that he believes that we're on track for 160 million voters, and we have never seen 150 million people vote. So we have a chance here with high voter turnout to overcome some of these dysfunctions and hopefully get a chance to fix them. What I have put here in this presentation are some sites for further information. So you can check those out at your leisure. And then finally, before I begin, I found these two, or I heard about these two sites today. They are places that are feeding people who are waiting online to vote. So you can donate to them to help feed people while they're waiting to vote online. Okay, so let me talk about the elections in the United States. Here's a very brief list of the dysfunctions that we face. Again, they can all be overcome with high voter turnout and in one constitutional amendment. So they are fixable, but they are major problems. So firstly, the way in which we vote using a method called first past the post, and the fact that we vote on a Tuesday in November, and it's not a holiday. That's just ridiculous and outrageous. I will discuss with you why the Senate and the Electoral College are way out of balance. The fact that we don't have term limits on most offices, the territories and the native tribes are not well represented at all. The Citizens United decision gutted our campaign finance laws. We basically have now minority rule institutionalized. It can all be fixed with high voter turnout. I would urge all of you to please look up the Jane Acre case. It's a long story, but basically it is a court case that allows, the ruling of which allows US news organizations to lie. Basically the court found that news organizations have no obligation to tell the truth. So that's a real problem, especially as we are likely to get a lot of misinformation in the wake of this election. So you have to ask yourself, the dysfunctions that I'm going to talk to you about are so blatantly obvious that you have to say, well, why haven't they been fixed? Well, the problem is that for the last 40 or 50 years, the citizenry has kind of not been great citizens. And politicians are not going to reform the system that put them in power, right? I mean, that's a nonsensical thing to ask them to do. So the citizenry has basically ceded any chance at reform to the politicians, and they're not going to reform the system that put them there. So change is going to have to come from the citizenry. So the first part of this presentation has a lot of background information. I'm going to jump ahead to several slides. This is a chart I made for my students about who could vote in United States elections over the period. Now, what I want you to note is the period in which we had what amounts to the mostly free, mostly fair, most people could vote was about 15 years, say 1966 to 1980. So we reached that point, and then what immediately comes in? Voter ID laws. So we reached the point where most people could vote freely and fairly, and then immediately one political party begins to try to restrict that, because that political party only wins when it cheats now. So as soon as we got to the point where, hey, we're so close to being a real democracy, certain forces in our country started to interfere with that. And voter suppression laws have done tremendous damage to this country and to the electorate. And if everyone who wanted to vote could vote freely and fairly, we would be looking at an entirely different country, totally different. You can read the sort of list here that I've given to you. Citizens United is a very complicated issue, but in short, it gutted campaign finance laws, and it has allowed legalized bribery. And because this is a Supreme Court decision, it can only be overcome by a constitutional amendment. There are subsequent rulings that did even more damage. And what is abundantly clear now is that unregulated, unreported money has flooded our electoral system from Israel, Turkey, China, Saudi Arabia, and other countries that have an interest in who runs this country. So our campaign finance system is a swamp of corruption. Other countries have full public financing of campaigns, and that eliminates that problem. So it can be done. Other countries have done it. There's no reason we can't. But I urge you to read more about Citizens United. The main issue that I want to remind you of is what they said was that money is free speech. Okay, but what that means is that people with more money than others have more free speech than others. And if I'm rich, I can give money to every member of Congress, right? I can donate to everyone. Whereas the average person can, get together 15 or 20 bucks for their local congressman or their local senator. Well, the system is such that they just have to go to the rich to get their money because it's just easier. So this is a very bad ruling, and it did tremendous damage to our republic. It can be fixed. But I've given you further information. The other Supreme Court decision that gutted elections in this country was Shelby County versus Holder. Please go read about it. Again, I want to move on and not get bogged down in any one point. But the Supreme Court literally said racism is no longer a problem in the United States. That's what they said in 2013. And that gutted parts of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which protected minority voters in former Confederate states and a few other states. And as soon as it was gone, Texas started passing voter ID laws, and other states immediately implemented voter ID laws. So this was a very bad decision. This plus Citizens United have helped Republicans win when they shouldn't. So let me now give you the quick rundown of some of the major dysfunctions that need to be fixed. The first is that the Senate is very out of balance. That whatever Enlightenment notion of the 1700s sounded wonderful back then is not applicable anymore. It's not. We have to move beyond the Enlightenment. We have to move beyond capitalism and all this other stuff that's held us back. We have to look forward, not back. The Senate as constituted has held us back because it gives too much power to 18% of the population. What do I mean by that? 18% of the US population control 52 Senate seats. That can't be right. It can't be right that 82% of the US population is represented by 48 seats. It can't be right. So this imbalance means, for example, that one California senator represents 20 million people. One North Dakota senator represents 380,000 people. What that means is that 380,000 people have as much power as 20 million people in California. That is a dysfunction that must be changed because it can't be right. It can't be right. Now, there are a number of ways in which the Senate could be reformed. You could award senators proportionally. You could say, every state elects one senator for every X number of population, 1 million, 2 million, 5 million. Everyone gets at least one, or everyone gets at least two, right? There are a number of things that could be done to fix this imbalance, but it is simply unfair because it gives enormous power to 18% of the population. And I think the fact that this hasn't been fixed is an outrage. And I gave you some links for some articles to look up. You can read about how we might reform the Senate. I'm sure you all know what gerrymandering is. Gerrymandering is creating congressional districts that essentially keep one party in power or in that office. And the practical effect of this is, for example, what happened in North Carolina in 2018. Republican candidates won 50% of the vote, but they were given 10 of the 13 seats. So again, this is a dysfunction that's been going on for 40 or 50 years, and it hasn't been fixed. How can that possibly be fair? That the parties split the vote 50-50, but then one party gets 10 out of 13. That can't be fair, and it has to be fixed. Voter ID laws tend to be the old Confederate states, but also Midwest states. They have distorted the vote. They did cost Hillary Clinton the election in 2016. There were several states where Trump won by a razor-thin margin. And the razor-thin margin would have been overcome by those who were prevented from voting. Let me conclude my part here, or get to the end of my part here, by talking about the Electoral College. And in this presentation, as you'll see, I've given you lots of information about it. But let me jump here. So this is the number of electoral votes that each state has. There are only 2 states that award those votes proportionally, Maine and Nebraska. All of the other states award them to the winner, all of the votes to the winner of the popular vote in that state. So essentially what that means is, as much as almost 50% of the state's population is disenfranchised. Maine and Nebraska do it so that the winner of the statewide popular vote gets 2, and then the winner of each congressional district gets 1. That's how it used to be done in the past. The Electoral College was designed to protect slavery. That's why it's there. It didn't have any other reason. It was there to protect slavery. And again, it is given disproportionate power to the South and to the rural parts of this country. What do I mean by that? Well, let's remind ourselves about that 18 and 20 and 82% gap, or differential there. That 18% of the US population controls 47% of the electoral votes you need to be elected president. So 82% of the population controls what? 60, whatever, 50, whatever it comes out to. I'm a terrible mathematician. How can that be right? So these are dysfunctions that are so obvious that I can't account to you why they haven't been fixed. So how am I doing on time, by the way?
Dr. Lynch, you still have another 10 minutes.
Oh, good. Oh, all right, good. I'm very happy to hear that. Thank you. Yeah. Here's just a horrifying graph. Whether Clinton or Trump won in 2016, look at the percentage of people that chose that candidate. 19.8% for Hillary Clinton, 19.5% for Donald Trump. That is a ridiculously low number. And it is a sign of dysfunction. Now, in part, it is due to voter suppression laws, in part. But it is also the sign of an electorate that has become completely disengaged, except for the fan base of each party, essentially. And you know, that's a good segue for me to talk for a moment about what I call the problem of the parties. Firstly, there is no liberal and conservative parties. That you got to drop that notion immediately. There's only 2 neoliberal parties. Now, there are third parties, but the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have spent centuries making sure that it's more difficult for third-party candidates to win. Because normally Democrats or Republicans control the state legislatures and the governor's mansions. So they have made it more difficult in many states, if not all states, for third parties to get traction. If we applied the scale that they use in Europe, our Democratic Party would be the conservative party. The Republican Party would be what it is now, which is a white nationalist party. But there would be parties to the quote unquote left. So, you know, one frustration that I face as a political historian is trying to get people to understand it's not liberal versus conservative. We don't have a functioning quote unquote liberal or progressive movement in this country. We have 2 neoliberal parties, and the only thing that they differ on is the environment, Obamacare, and abortion. They vote for the same economic bills. They vote for the same military spending. They vote for the same tax cuts. So you must dispel that notion immediately. Now, when we were watching the returns on Super Tuesday, I said to my best friend who I was watching it with, you know, I've watched the Democratic Party shoot itself in the foot my entire life. That's what they're paid to do. Wall Street pays them to let the Republicans get away with ripping things to shreds. That's just the reality. And I'm not saying that to you as a Bernie voter. I'm saying that to you as a social scientist. That's how it works. That we have one party that's paid to be incompetent, and we have another party that's paid to rip everything out. And that's how it's been. And the other thing that is important is that the Congress gave up on governing. They just decided it was easier to let the Supreme Court decide things. So these two organizations that we call political parties have devolved to the point where all they do is raise money. This is a real problem. It could be solved by full public financing of all campaigns. Other countries do it. And I have heard elected officials complain, oh, you know, we have to spend so much time fundraising. Well, fine, Institute of Public Financing law, and you don't have to spend any time fundraising. So again, you know, if it's a simple fix, why hasn't it been fixed? Well, Donald Trump, from 2017 until today, raised $1 billion. He now has $63 million left, and he has nothing to show for it. They blew through $1 billion, and they have nothing to show for it. What they did do was buy 100,000 copies of Don Jr.'s book to get it on the New York bestseller list. They spent money on private jets, and they spent money at Trump properties. So the reason why this hasn't been fixed is we're asking the people who are looting it to fix it. That isn't going to happen. Why would they? So we don't only face systemic corruption and dysfunction. The people who are supposed to represent us are a major part of that dysfunction. And I want to add here, you've all heard the term Reagan Revolution. What they don't ever tell you is the Reagan Revolution was against the New Deal. They don't explain that part of it. And since the Reagan Revolution, we've ripped out the protections that were once there, because there's one class of people that enriches. The answer to many of our problems, full public financing of all campaigns and proportional voting. And I gave you lots of examples here about proportional voting. And there are many ways in which we could reform our system. But the system that we use is called first past the post. And what that means is a candidate can win with as little as 34% of the vote. So you can have a candidate who, you know, 60 whatever percent of the constituency voted against them. That can't be right. Easy fix. Ranked choice voting, proportional voting. Very easy fix. So I've given you some descriptions about proportional voting you can read through. I gave you some sample ballots about what that might look like and how elections might go. Ranked choice voting is on the ballot in Massachusetts this year, and I'm strongly in favor of it myself. Let me, so in the slide presentation, I've given you lots of descriptions of proportional voting, how they might be applied, what they look like, how they work. Ranked choice voting is very simple. You're given a ballot and you're said rank your candidates from 1 to however many are running. And so the wonderful thing about ranked choice voting is that under most circumstances, most people will be represented by their first or second choice. That's much better than the system we have now. And so you have a ballot and you say, you know what, I really love this guy. Then I want her next and then him. Or, you know, you can deny it the other votes if you want. You can just rank your own number one and say, I'm not going to give any more votes to any other candidates. You can do that too. I am an advocate that there should always be the option none of the above. Like, I think that when we vote, we should have the option to say, I reject all of these candidates. Because that's a powerful message that voters can send. So let me conclude by just showing you that I put together a few slides with my suggested changes. And then I've given you the full thing in the sample constitutional amendment at the end of this presentation. But very simple: expand the House to 1,200 members, expand the representation of the territories into the tribes, outlaw gerrymandering, outlaw voter suppression, expand the Senate, raise the terms from 4 years, 8 years, 6 years for the president, full public financing of all campaigns, making federal holiday for election day, moving election day. Why don't we have that in May? It could be the first Monday in May. Why does it have to be in November? It doesn't make any sense anymore. So what I hope I've conveyed to you is that we do live in a dysfunctional system, but it can be fixed. The fixes are not difficult to understand. They really are not. What we need, though, is an engaged citizenry that will work to push for these fixes. When this election is over, Better Elections Now is going to be pushing on or working on how we can do that. And I'm sure lots of other groups will be too. So thank you all very, very much for listening. And I'm very happy now to turn things over to my friend and my colleague, Dr. Mello. I'm going to stop sharing, Dr. Mello, and you can go right ahead.
Thanks very much for your presentation, and his slideshow will be in the chat box if you would like to open it up and save it and read some of those slides that had a lot of detail on them. So Dr. Mello, thank you. Please
Excellent. I imagine that you are now able to see my screen.
Yes, we do.
So thank you for coming here tonight and listen to us. And I decided to talk about the French case for a couple of reasons. I thought France might make a really nice fold to the United States as a case for us to think about. Not because France presents an ideal, perfect case. I mean, they too have their issues around their elections and their own electoral systems and their own social justice issues within the country as well, and who gets to participate and doesn't. But because France, a couple of reasons. One is France also had an electoral college and they got rid of it. So they're kind of an interesting parallel in that sense. And France also has single member districts, and as we do, but they do them slightly differently, which allows for both a multi-party system to thrive and for voters to feel that their heard is, that their vote counts more, that it's heard more. So those were the two things that led me to think about France in particular as a comparison here. And hopefully you'll be able to see the parallels with me as I go through the presentation. So in thinking about comparing France to the United States, France is what we call a semi-presidential system. It means that it has a president. It is now a very, very strong president in the current constitution, and it has a weaker prime minister, right? So that both the president and the prime minister have 5-year terms. There's a parliament, who's the equivalent of our Congress, and it's also bicameral, like ours. It has a national assembly and it has a Senate. France is a well-functioning multi-party system, though. I mean, there are clearly two one center-right, one center-left party that are sort of the dominant parties in the system, but France has multiple parties, and I'll show you a slide later on that really will illustrate just how many people got to run in the presidential election in the last election, and so many parties are represented. So the electoral system is what we call a 2-round runoff with single-member constituencies. Now, I know that that's a mouthful, but the idea is actually simple enough, right? So 2 rounds, single-member constituencies. So single-member constituency is similar to first past the post, what we have in the United States and that the British have in the UK, right? That every district is won by only one person, right? No matter how many people run for one seat, right? The winner takes it all to a certain extent. Well, in France, the winner doesn't just take it all. So in the UK, something that normally happens is, let's say that you have 5 parties and they're all competing for 1 seat in that particular district. The party that gets 1 more vote than all the other parties will take it all, right? That's a winner take all. So you can actually have a situation in which someone only gets 25% of the vote or 30% of the vote, but they won they won the seat, right? That's the winner take all. In France, this is avoided by the runoff, right? So what the runoff does is when you vote for whatever party you really prefer. And then the top 2 vote getters have a runoff between them. So you actually, as a voter, get to cast 2 ballots, one for, your preferred party, or individual, the person that you really want to see representing your district or your constituency. And then, right, in the second one, maybe your candidate made it through, maybe your candidate didn't, and you need to evaluate which one of the 2 top vote getters is the one that you prefer, right? I can come back to some of those points later if you want to, or if you have questions about them later for the Q&A. So when did they get rid of the Electoral College? Before 1962, the Collège des Notables, notable electors, is basically an electoral college that was constituted by about 80,000 counties, city councilors, county and city councilors that would select not just the president, but also the Senate, right? So only the lower house was directly elected. Both the Senate and the president were indirectly selected, right, by this electoral college. After 1962, President Charles de Gaulle here, a very famous president of French 20th century politics, he's the one who led the charge in changing, making a constitutional revision in very unusual ways, which I can tell you about later as well. But he managed to basically work with the prime minister to pass, not to pass, but to, the word I want. He, with the prime minister's agreement, he actually had a referendum on whether or not the French wanted to directly elect the president. And an overwhelming amount of people participated in the referendum. Over 70%, I think actually closer to 80% of voters participated in that. And they overwhelmingly said that, yes, they wanted to directly elect the president. And that led to the constitutional change that allowed the president to become directly elected. Now, Charles de Gaulle did this for a variety of reasons, but perhaps the most important one was that he wanted more power. Right? He wanted more legitimacy for the position of the president vis-a-vis the prime minister. And this was a very fast way and good way to get it, a legitimate way to get it, right? He also reduced, in the same electoral reform, he reduced the term of the president from 7 to 5 years. And the president in France is also selected through this runoff system. So most of my discussion is only about presidential elections, but for the president in France, you have multiple candidates and you have 2 rounds. And in the first round, again, you vote for whoever your heart desires, right? And the 2 top vote getters are then going to go into a runoff, and the voters get to vote once again on who they prefer. This is only avoided at any level that of a runoff. This is only avoided if there's a clear, overwhelming win by one of the candidates, 50% of the vote plus 1, right? So I'm not going to go over this graph that you're looking at right now, but I like to see a scheme of institutions. What you can see here, if we start by looking at the voters, that all citizen voters now directly elect the president of France. They also directly elect the National Assembly, right? And the Electoral College, right, which does get selected by the citizens, are the one only have a say over the Senate at this moment, right? So the president is really a representative of, of it's elected through a direct vote. I apologize. How do you get on the ballot, right? How do you get to run for the election, to be considered a candidate in any election? So you need to be a citizen. You need to be over the age of 18. You need to be registered to vote. You need to gather 500 signatures from elected officials across at various levels, at the local level, at the departmental level, at the regional level in France. And you need to spread those over 30 departments, which in France are this sub-regions. And you need to have no more than 50 signatures for each one of those areas. The one thing that I put here that I think is important for us to think about, especially for us who get to vote in the United States and who are American, right, that you don't have to register to vote in France. You are automatically registered to vote the moment you turn 18, right? You only have to sort of contact you only have to contact the officials, the administration, if you're actually changing where you live, right? So if you live in one department and suddenly you move to another department, you need to officially tell them, right? And officially change your address. And that immediately officially changes your voter registration. So there's none of this thing of, getting booted out of the rolls if you didn't vote over the last election and having to register again and having to make sure that you're registered. That simply doesn't exist for the French citizen and for many European citizens. I also want to talk about campaign financing because it's a really big issue, and it's something that wouldn't be that difficult to change in the American system. This would not take a constitutional amendment, I would think. So financing a campaign. Campaigning in France is only allowed for about 2 weeks. Think about that. Okay, there are about 2 weeks of a campaign, no more than that. So there's no campaign fatigue or electoral fatigue from the voter side, right? About a campaign that starts a year or a year and a half before you actually have to go and cast a vote. So there are also very legal limits on campaign spending. I pulled up the numbers here on the left for what those limits were for each party that ran in the presidential election for 2017. So in 2017 in France, in the first round, each party could spend a maximum of 16.8 million euros, maximum per party. And in the second round, that was voted by about 5 million. So if you made it to the second round, you could spend up to 22.5 million euros. Okay, so the euro is close to the dollar. It's a little bit more in terms of dollars. So say 17 something million dollars and about 23 something million dollars. I did pull up the numbers for our last presidential election. Between Clinton and Trump, they spent about $1.9 billion in campaigning in 2016. Those are the official numbers, 1.9 billion, right? So here we're talking about peanuts. I mean, really, in comparison, this is almost nothing. This is a hard cap. Any party that surpasses this is going to be penalized under the letter of the law. So elections are publicly financed. So any candidate who secures at least 5% of the vote in the first round gets reimbursed almost half of the cost of the campaign. And they have to sort of present the billing, right, with receipts, posters, printing, TV, radio ads, right, in order to get that reimbursement. If you get less than 5% of the vote, then you get about 5% reimbursement. So there is a bit of a threshold, right? So small parties really need to break it over that 5% threshold if they want to get more money back for what they spend. Another important part here is private contributions. Sean was talking about Citizens United and what that has done to the United States. Private contributions are very, very tightly regulated in France. There is a maximum of 4,600 euros per person. It's about $5,000. It's a hard maximum. There is no limit for a candidate, like how much money a candidate wants to spend in his own campaign, right? The only limit, of course, is that it cannot be more than that cap, the 16.8 million euros. So if a candidate is uber wealthy, right, and wants to pay for everything, they certainly can do it, but they still have to cap the amount that they spend at $16.8 million. So in the next couple of slides, I want to talk a little bit about media and social media rules, since this is a huge topic in this electoral cycle and in the previous electoral cycle. It's a huge topic across European elections as well. And the French are perhaps the state that has been the most proactive in trying to legislate issues having to do with fake news and media use and dissemination of false information during the elections and during campaigns. So in terms of media rules, and here I'm talking about traditional media, so broadcast media, so the airtime that candidates get is really strictly controlled. And this is very typical of European democracies in general. So during an official campaign, TV and radio really have to provide equal airtime to each one of the candidates. I put it up here for you that an equivalent of that in the US is that this year, Kanye West would get the same airtime as Trump or Biden, right? Because he's running to become president. And so would Brock Pierce. I don't know if you know that Brock Pierce is running. I only found out a few days ago that Brock Pierce was running, but I was very amused by it. It's very amusing videos, in my opinion. Go and check them out. But they would all, like any official candidate, right, that met the requirements to actually become a candidate, would have equal airtime, right? And this is a great equalizer for parties that don't have a lot of funds, right? Or that perhaps don't have a candidate that the media really wants to follow around and, you know, provide sort of free coverage for. So it's again, it's a good equalizer for small and big parties in terms of broadcast media. I also want to speak briefly about this new law, which it's not without controversy in France. But in 2018, the French were so scorched by the Russian attempts to influence their elections as well, right? And other countries, but and by the problems that the dissemination of fake news going viral had caused during the election, that they passed a law, the 2018 law against the dissemination of false information. And this was very pointed towards social media in particular. And I highlighted what I consider to be sort of the two most important aspects of that law. So in the 3 months before an election, so even though the campaign for an election is only 2 weeks by law in France, in the 3 months before an election, candidates and parties can get court orders to stop false information about their parties. And once these court orders get issued, social media companies have as little as a few hours to get rid of that content. And if they don't, they'll be penalized. The other thing that's quite interesting is this foreign media aspect of this 2018 law, that TV channels controlled by a foreign state or under the influence of a foreign state can be suspended if they are found to, quote, deliberately disseminate false information likely to affect the sincerity of the ballot. So what the French are saying here is, okay, it's a globalized TV world, right? And our laws control our TV stations, but how do we control the information coming from outside of France, right? And this is a pretty sort of harsh aspect, because if a judge decides that there was deliberate dissemination of false information, and the judge can decide on this fairly quickly, that channel will be suspended for the duration that the judge decides, or at least until the end of the election. So for most violations of this law are punishable with about 75,000 euro fee, up to a year in prison. And every outlet in France is now required to publicly disclose sources of funding of any promoted content and any promoted speech that they have. So if they're being paid for any sort of speech, doesn't have to be an ad, right? Any sort of promoted speech, they have to disclose who is doing that. how am I in terms of time?
You have 4 more minutes.
Okay, well, I'll try to go quickly through this idea. So leading to election day, there's also the day of reflection. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. So the election silence, another thing that is very typical across democracies around the world, but that we don't have in the United States. What this means is that there will be no campaigning and no polling allowed the day before and the day of the election. What's funny is that in the United States, it's a social media company that is trying to do that, right? Facebook is trying to basically impose a day of silence or a week of silence almost, right? In its own platform. So that's, something else to think about. Media cannot announce the victor until 8 p.m. of the election day, and elections are always held on Sundays, right? And this ensures that France has systematically had a turnout of 70 to 80% of its electorate. So just to illustrate some of the points I made earlier, these were all of the candidates and their parties that ran for the last presidential election. You can see that they're really, really varied. From right to left, from libertarian to right-wing populist. I mean, there's really almost every political flavor you can think of up here. In the first round, right, some of the effects that I was talking about, you can see that the vote was really split across 4 main candidates, right? And you can see that nobody really got even close to a majority in the first round. In the first round, voters tend to vote for the party of their preference and the candidate of their preference. In the second round, if you follow French elections, you know that it was a very heated election because it was between a newcomer, Emmanuel Macron, very pro-Europe, and someone who had been in politics for quite a bit and who's a far-right nationalist, Marine Le Pen, right? And you can see that in the second round, look at the change in the vote again. So Le Pen got 21.4%. In the first round, that's 23.9%. But when faced between a centrist or a radical in the election, the electorate overwhelmingly went to the center, right, in the past French election. So this is my last slide, just to conclude with some thoughts about what I just talked about. Some of the advantages of this 2-round direct election are that, voters feel more heard, right? They feel that their preferences actually are heard. That's another big issue in the United States. You often hear, oh, my vote doesn't count because I live in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is going to be blue, etc. That is avoided here. They feel more represented. There's a plurality of voices because it's a multi-party system that really does allow for all of these parties to feel that they could be competitive and they can be competitive. It adds legitimacy to the presidential pick because he or she are directly elected by the voters, and this generally tends to increase voter turnout. And my final takeaways here, again, is the same point I started with. No electoral system is perfect, but some of them allow citizens to feel more represented than others, right? And in democratic societies, we should strive for plurality, and we should strive for including as many voices and as many interests as possible. And I think I speak for both of us presenting here that what we want is for all of us to be voting, to be engaged, and to be mobilizing, right, for the change we want to see out there. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mellon. How about a round of applause, virtual round of applause for all of our speakers. Well, if you would stop sharing the screen, we can see one another's faces, and then we can take questions for the speaker. And if you just like to raise your hand, and I'll be able to see you, or you can also raise your little blue hand too, and I can call on you. Are there any questions?
Or comments?
Or comments, questions or comments?
Or discussion topics. One thing I would add to what Daniela was just saying is that the major benefit of a proportional system is that it forces compromise. And we live in a system where either one party gets everything or the other party paralyzes everything. And that's nonsensical. It doesn't make any sense, right? And what's really fascinating now that I'm thinking about it, in I think it was the 1859 congressional elections, the Republicans, which at that point were the Progressive Party, won control of enough of Congress that they could paralyze the government for 2 years, and they did. And that was to prevent the advancement of slavery, right? And so now, since the 80s, they've been paralyzing government for a whole different reason, right? So a system that expands the number of voices is important, right? Because I mean, the fact that we're stuck with two parties that are basically the same party is a dysfunction, you know, whereas we could easily have a system where other voices are there, and the more voices, the better. One of the things that I use in my class when I talk about the Enlightenment is a scene from the movie about Mozart, Amadeus, where he's showing his play, the play by Beaumarchais, Figaro. And he has a scene where we start with one person singing, and then two, and then three, and then four. And this, what began as a solo becomes this chorus. And there's harmony in the chorus. So, you know, proportional voting is about bringing some balance and harmony to a system that is not working very well, in my opinion, as a social scientist.
Well, I thought it was interesting to think about the contrast between ranked choice voting, which is on the ballot in Massachusetts this year, and the two-round voting they had in France, because those are really different sorts. In ranked choice, you have to put all your choices on one ballot. So you don't have kind of like a second analysis of who's leading. Whereas the two-round ones, you get to make a second choice. And so I think that did give the voters a little more control. You know, that's an interesting difference from ranked choice, which in some ways is seen of kind of like the great solution here, but the two-round one might be even more interesting.
Yeah, especially, I mean, we don't have to be a two-party system. We sort of evolved into a two-party system. So no matter how many parties try to enter, you know, the U.S. try to run, they're just not competitive. They're, you know, the rules are leaving them out, or the game has been changed to a point where they can't break in. But if we had a two-round system, they would be able to get in. We might have many more independent candidates actually make it through, right? And we might have many more new parties, like the Greens, for instance, might be able to really mobilize to get some seats in Congress and form a caucus and all of that.
You know, let me, if you don't mind, let me jump back. Oh, sorry, go ahead if there's a question.
Joanie, please go ahead.
Hi, I mean, if I can change the topic of conversation a little bit, but I feel that like I learned a lot about the relationship between the electoral system and the legitimacy of the election from these two fascinating presentations. But my question is about voter engagement, which I think one of the great things that I learned from these two presentations is that, like, I'm surprised that in France, voter turnout, as Dr. Mello said, it's 70% to 80% versus, as Dr. Lynch was reporting, voter turnout in the US was merely 40%, less than 45%. And for Dr. Mello, I'm wondering whether you can say something about why you think that France managed to have such an impressive voter turnout, particularly when compared with the US case. And for Dr. Lynch, I'm wondering whether you can say something about ways for citizens to engage in politics. Obviously, in the coming 2 weeks, the most important things for us to do is to go vote. But besides voting, I'm wondering whether you have some thoughts about what we can do in order to get more engaged. Thank you.
Okay, I think those are great questions. So thank you very much. The answer is quite simple, right? It is easy to vote. It is simply easy to vote. You go on a Sunday, almost, you know, if you've been lucky enough, I think, to visit Europe, you know that in a lot of European states, shops don't even open on Sunday, right? You really have to figure out something else to do, right? Be outdoors with your family, go watch a soccer game maybe, right? But a lot of you know, European societies, and France is certainly a great example of this. Sunday is really a day of rest for the most part, right? So there's complete availability of the voter to go vote if the voter so wants, right? So the voter doesn't have to worry with, am I registered? Am I not registered, right? I'm definitely registered if I am a French citizen and I, you know, haven't moved, right, from one city to another and forgot to tell the authorities. So, you know, you're registered, it's easy to vote. The campaign has been in the news every day for the past month, right, or so. You know, you know that it's happening. There's also a culture of being quite active in the political parties themselves in France, right? Not just, you know, a passive member of the party that only votes at that particular, when the election comes along. So France has a long history of serious mobilization and mobilization of labor unions for the vote as well, and for different parties. So, you know, there are multiple factors, but at the end of the day, I think the answer is really quite simple. It's easy, right? It's easy.
Sounds like an easy fix for the US, as Dr. Lynch was suggesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why I'm very frustrated, because it's everything, it's an easy fix, you know. So to answer your wonderful questions, the systemic problems have to be fixed. So we have to end voter suppression. We have to make election day a holiday, because, you know, think about it this way. There's a reason why at every election, retired people vote the most, because they're retired, because most places don't give time off to vote. In many places, particularly in the southern states, there are stories of factory owners or business owners saying to their employees, you will vote for who I tell you to vote for, or I will fire you. So there are people who are prevented from voting for nonsensical reasons, because there is no voter fraud in this country. There's none. There's election fraud. Elections are being stolen every cycle, but there's no voter fraud. So the targeted, like, voter ID laws and stuff, well, that suppresses the vote. That's number one. Number two, we've devolved into a tribalist society where, you know, I keep seeing things like, you know, on Twitter and stuff like, vote blue, vote red, vote what? What is blue and red? So we've devolved to the point where people are just voting by color, right? Because that's the tribe that they want to belong to for whatever reason, right? And you have this perception that one party is good and one party is evil, right? And that somehow that this party does things better when they're the same party. They're two wings of the same party. And thirdly, there's been a number of studies that have concluded that this country is just a flat out oligarchy, that the democracy doesn't work. And that is because of the campaign finance laws. So people become disengaged, right? And then, oh, and you know, the other thing too, it used to be that students were taught civics, and that's gone out the window, right? I mean, I really and sincerely believe that every student, starting from the age of whatever, 5 or 10, part of their curriculum every single year is the Constitution, elections. What does it mean to be a good citizen? How do you stay engaged, right? And unfortunately, we live in a society where people are rewarded for disengaging. And, you know, oh, and so what I heard last night was that in 2016, Donald Trump didn't raise that much money, but he got $2 billion in free advertising. $2 billion, because CNN would put the camera on him and just let it run, right? With no counterweight, no counter explanation, no nothing, right? So you have information overload, and you have people who are purposely misleading us, and there's no control over it, right? So people feel disengaged because the system isn't responsive to them. They feel disengaged because they can't get there, because it's been made very difficult, right? And this is what my immediate response to people is, if the Republican Party had a platform that people wanted to vote for, they wouldn't have to prevent people from voting. That's it. So why is that still happening? you know? And again, a part of the problem is that we are depending on the people to fix things that are in power because they're dysfunctional. And so, you know, groups like Better Elections Now or BuVotes are everybody. When this election is over, we have to start hammering home. We need major reform on multiple levels. And what I would hope, what I'm begging, what I'm really like, is that this generation of college students, having lost everything that they lost this year, are waking up to the fact that this system is completely unworkable at this point, and that we need massive reform. And that will engage them. Because if we say to them, well, what do you think? What do you want? What society do you want? What do you want to build? What do you think is important, right? The rest of us failed. What do you want? So I think the engagement comes when we sort of hand stuff over to them and just say, you guys have to start building something better because we failed. And that's what I would like to see happen. I'm sorry I went on for so long.
Thank you, Dr. Linton. Are there other questions? I have a couple I'd like to ask, but are there others in the audience who would like to ask some questions? All right, well, let me ask Dr. Mello. So let me just check to make sure I understood you correctly. I think you said to get on the ballot, you have to, the candidate has to get 500 signatures from elected officials. So not just ordinary citizens, from elected officials. So that's quite different than in the United States, I think.
Right.
Does the system kind of reproduce itself in any way, since you have to get the support of existing elected officials in order to get on the ballot?
That's an interesting question. So it's not just signatures from elected officials. They also need to get citizen signatures. Maybe I didn't make that clear enough, right? And they definitely need to make sure that they have support amongst elected officials, which is kind of an interesting French nuance to the process of collecting signatures to make sure that you're on the ballot. So you have to get them from multiple départements, right, in order to show that you have national reach potentially, right, and that you have national support. But yes, those 500 signatures from elected officials do need to be. I don't know if I can answer the second part of your question. Does it reproduce itself? Yes, I think to a certain extent it does, right? If you are an individual who is already pretty well connected within a party, it's not going to be that hard to be able to get those signatures to run. If you're a brand newcomer, you need to knock at a lot of doors and convince a lot of people, or even just to get access, right? To be able to get that signature in. So it might actually be a barrier to entry now that I think about it.
Well, then my second question, also looking at France, is one of the things I've thought in this country, if we eliminate the Electoral College and it were just the popular vote, wouldn't that give more influence to the cities, and the rural areas would be really ignored? Now, at the moment, we have the opposite situation. Mm-hmm. But if that's what they did in France, do the urban centers have a disproportionate weight in the elections? And I know farmers are very important in France. And so, you know, I'm not sure how that works out, but if it's just a vote across the country without being divided up into the different départements, you know, it's whoever gets the nationwide vote wins. Does it favor the cities more? Does it favor some parts of the country rather than others?
I think that the answer is that you get representation at different levels. And when it comes to the presidential vote, it's a direct vote, right? So it's really weighing, it doesn't go by region, right? It goes like it's all of the nation voting on this one representative. The rural urban divide comes more at the other levels, right? And the representation also comes at the other levels. So, you know, in rural areas are going to select electors, right? That are going to select the senators that favor their interests, right? And in the more urban areas, right, they will, oh, I see a very interesting cat. Very Halloweeny, I loved it. Sorry. So you do get that representation, but when it comes to the presidential election, it's not about those cleavages, right? It's about every voter having equal weight in that particular election. So those cleavages they get representation at the other levels, right? At the regional levels, and then at the house, at their equivalent of the House, right? The Parliament, the National Assembly, and then the Senate.
Does that set up tensions between the president who's elected on the national vote and the regional representation in the, is it the National Assembly or the Senate, or maybe both?
Does it set up tensions between them? Absolutely.
Tensions. So I'm thinking, for instance, farm policy as an example. It is the person who wins the national vote likely to have a much different view on something like that than the National Assembly or the Senate?
Well, there's always a lot of tensions. One of the biggest tensions that used to happen until they aligned the elections between the National Assembly and the presidential was that sometimes the prime minister was from a different party from the president, right? And the entire they call that cohabitation, right? Cohabitation, but barely, because they would have complete gridlock. Right? So it is still a multi-party system, and in a multi-party system, right? Farmers' interests really get represented by more of one party than other parties, right? But if you want to be if you want to be a Macron, right? You want to speak to farmers, and you want to speak to neoliberals who want to stay in the European Union, and you want to speak to the people in the cities. I think that having the second round really adds, how to put this, it makes the voter responsible for the choice of the president in a different way, right? So even if you didn't select that president in the first round, you still have to decide to cast that second ballot, right? And in the second ballot, you need to take responsibility for one of these two people that made it through. That may, assuage things for the voter in general, but it doesn't do that in terms of like the competition between the different parties in the system. So in any multi-party system like the French system, there are so many competing interests and so many competing voices represented both in the Senate and in the lower house that they really need to, if they don't want gridlock, they really need to find sort of ways in which they can collaborate with each other, right? And France had a lot of gridlock for a very long time, and ever since they kind of aligned elections, they no longer have that with the prime minister in particular.
Thank you. Thank you. And are there any other questions? I do have one for Dr. Lynch, if no one else has another question. Dr. Lynch, let me say this. So you've raised a lot of issues, problems in the system, in the US system, and we don't see a path forward really to changing them, even though some of the fixes are pretty easy, as you've said. And at the same time, our country is going through this racial reckoning. And I wonder if there's a connection. Is there a connection between those two? Is there kind of a racial message or a racist message in some of these things, or a racist effect? Does race interact with some of these resistances to changing the American electoral system?
It's at the base of it. Think about, for example, the term states' rights. Okay, but states' right to do what? Because the original states' right argument was to have slavery, right? So the country was founded on a system of forced labor. The southern states had the forced labor. The northern states had the factories that depended on that forced labor. So you had a symbiotic system of two sections, right? And then of course the sections grow because others come along. So I said at the beginning, the Electoral College was founded to protect slavery. That the Electoral College was there to prevent an anti-slavery president in some fashion, or what they hoped. The result of all of that is that in 2020, we live in a society where Black men can be murdered in the streets and no one is punished. Where Black women can be asleep in their bed and shot in the head and no one is punished. So when these states are talking about states' rights, they are still talking about white supremacy. that the reason these rural and southern states are so terrified is that they don't want to give up the white supremacy system that is in place. And you brought up a good point that if we were to abolish the electoral college altogether, right, that would favor the urban system. Well, yeah, because that's where most people live. So why wouldn't we favor it, right? Whereas the system we now, which you noted very well, is completely wrong the other way, right? Now, the fear that the rural voters have about the urban governance is that the urban governance isn't going to put up with white supremacy. That's what they're afraid of. There's no other reason to be afraid, right? Because urban voters aren't going to suddenly bankrupt all the farmers, right? They're not going to suddenly ruin American farming, because people who live in cities need that food too, right? So the fear is only about the racism, because racism built the system as it is. And unless we confront that, it's not going to get any better. And so what's really great, though, is that the racism that has come out in the last several years is so blatant that the students who are, that we interact with, they can't really hide from it, right? Unless they really want to. And the more they are confronted with that, the more likely it is for their generation to say, what are we doing? We got to fix all this right now, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, but the racism is still the problem. The idea, the Supreme Court had the unmitigated gall to say that racism is no longer a problem in this country, right? I mean, that is straight out of the Ministry of Peace in 1984. I mean, the level of nonsense that requires is so high that I can't even believe it. So the race is the problem, and the race is why they will resist. And no person in power is going to voluntarily give it up. That's who's going to do that. So it's going to be a fight, but it's a fight that can be won. Like I get very aggravated because when I bring up some of the solutions and stuff, and I don't mean to suggest I'm aggravated with anybody here, but in conversations I've had, what I immediately get is, well, we can't do that because we can't do that because, and it's, wait a minute, you don't know that. We haven't tried, right? You just have a bunch of people say, well, we can't do that, but no one has made the effort in any sustained way, right? And so if you have an entire generation, 2 generations, millennials and Zoomers, if we can get them to stand up for themselves, we can step back and they can build what we failed to build. So, and they'll do it without regard to race, I would think, for the most part.
Changing demographics too are a factor here. Not only is the younger generation, the rising generation, more diverse, but it's also, outnumbering the white population, more and more. And so maybe demographics, are one of the things that will bring around about some change in the system.
Yeah, hopefully.
All right, are there any other questions? It's really lovely to have you all participate in this, and very nice to see people both from College of General Studies, BuVotes, Boston University Student Government. I will say, right, Hassan, right. I don't know if he is still on the call, but Hassan has led the way to make Election Day a holiday at BU, a no class day, or a day with class flexibility. Has circulated a petition around the university, which already has hundreds of signatures, in hoping to appeal to the president to give students flexibility on election day this year, so that they will be able to go out and vote. For those students who want to go out in person and vote, it's uncertain among all the uncertainties of this year. Here's one more uncertainty. How long will the lines be on election day? And will it take students a long time to vote once they go to the polling place? Everything has to be socially distanced. Mm-hmm. And with some uncertainties about the mail system and the high voter turnout that's expected, we don't know quite what's going to happen, but allowing the students flexibility on election day would be a very good thing.
Absolutely.
We'll see how BU responds to some of these interests in bringing about electoral reform.
Susan, can I just add one thing? I'm sure we're ready to wrap up, but it is likely that beginning on election day and until we know for certain what the result is, that we will be flooded with misinformation. And what I hope that we can all do is to do everything we can to be the level-headed person in the room who says, now wait a minute, Grandpa, Obama isn't drinking baby's blood. You know, that we have to start telling people that you can't put up with the lies. You can't accept it. You know, you can't hear someone say that Joe Biden is a child trafficker and let them get away with it. You know, this notion that your opinion is just as good as mine, opinion is not fact, and people are treating it that way. So we are going to be hit with a flood of lies when this election is going on. We all have to be calm, be cool, be collected, and remind people that, you know, we don't know the answer until we know the answer. We don't know what's happened until we know. There's no point in screaming. There's no point in yelling. There's no point in talking about the Second Amendment solution. There's no point in talking about any of this until we know what the vote says. So I would encourage everybody to really discuss with people, like, you have to calm down, stop with this Super Bowl nonsense, and let's find out what actually happened. I'm sorry, Danielle, were you gonna say something?
Yeah.
Well, I thought that I was looking at Kyla here, who's been watching us, and it looked like she had a question to ask of us. So I wanted to make sure that before I know your hand didn't get raised, but you know, I like to read.
Kayla took part in Vote Big, so I know that she's heavily involved here. So Kayla, do you have a question to ask?
I did want to say yay for the BU initiative. Northeastern's doing something really similar where we have petitions circulating and a few hundred signatures. I don't know whether our president Aoun is actually going to like follow through with some of that. He doesn't exactly have a history of listening to student initiatives, but we will see. And the other thing I want to add is that NPR said yesterday that a number of voters across Alaska and Florida got vote for Trump or else, with like threatening emails saying we have access, and they were only targeting Democratic voters. They were saying, we have access to all of the election information and we know that you're a Democrat and we are going to like potentially harm you if you don't vote for Trump. And it was just terrible. So we're definitely also expecting a lot of like intimidation, both like robocalls and then emails. And they found ways to get around some spam filters too. So another thing too is just making sure that particularly like elderly members who might like read into that and believe it are aware that no, like you can still vote for Biden. They're not going to actually be able to hurt you. Yeah, definitely a lot to watch.
Yeah, there's a
So
lot.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah, it's going to be an intense month after this election.
It is a dark time, you know, and the threat of violence is really troubling, you know, very troubling. And I think there are small communities, you know, small rural communities where the threat of violence would be much more effective, you know, than in larger cities. So
for sure.
Yeah. Yes. So very nice to have you all join us. And so why don't we, Danielle, would you like to conclude? What would you like to say?
I would like to say a couple of things. One is that because we're over Zoom, I was able to double check myself on something I said earlier. And your Professor Lee's question about the 500 signatures, actually, it's only 500 signatures from elected officials. You don't need to have any citizen signatures. So that does create, of course, you know, an immediate barrier of access. But even then, there are multiple elected officers at various levels, right?
Yeah.
So it is, I just wanted to make sure that I clarified that because I was able to Google it while we were talking. And
Thank you.
so
Thank you.
I'll pass the word again to you.
Thank you. Well, let's end up with our BuVotes message. Go out and vote, everyone. Cast your ballot for the person of your choice, and may the best person win. So thank you, everyone. And how about a round of applause for our two speakers? Yeah.
Presentation.
Thank you, everyone. And Daniela, this
Thank
was
you for
very
coming.
good. So,
Very, very interesting.
thank you.
So,
Thank
good
you.
evening and best wishes to you all.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Daniela.